Welcome to the 2020 Greensteading Summit, presented by the Green Dream Project. This is a special series of videos featuring permaculturists, homesteaders, farmers, gardeners, and people dedicated to sustainable living. We thank you so much for joining us.
Hey y'all, this is Chris with Rockin' 8 Farm, and for those of you who don't know who I am or what Rockin' 8 Farm is, I guess I've got to give you a little bit of the who, what, and why. So we'll do kind of a brief introductory segment here just to let you know who we are and why we do what we do, and then we'll move on into some of the things that we're actually doing on our property and the reasons that we do those things on our property. So Rockin' 8 Farm is a roughly 5.5 acre kind of permaculture experiment and family farm. My wife and I, her name is Jessica. We've been together for about 25 years and we have 8 children together. We've got 5 of them out of the house or soon to be out of the house, and we've got 3 kiddos left at home. So now you know where the Rockin' 8 Farm comes from. It's kind of in honor of our 8 children. You're not going to see a whole lot of Jess and the kids in this particular video because A, it's a little more instructional, and B, they're all very busy and have their own lives. So if you want to get to know Jess and the kids a little bit better, you're going to have to head on over to Rockin' 8 Farm's YouTube channel and take a look at some of the videos that they're in. Now, Jess and I started studying kind of the farming and permaculture and more self-sufficiency type of lifestyle about 5 or 6 years ago by reading the blogs and reading the books and grabbing the newspaper articles and getting on the websites. But we just moved on to this property about 2 years ago, and that's where our journey really began. I think that kind of covers who and what, but in order to really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of it, we need to look at the why. First of all, my wife and I are kind of tired of buying boxes of food that when you look on the back, you can't read any of the ingredients. Especially because when we pull everything out of our garden and make a meal, I can name every ingredient that's in that meal. That's something that's kind of nice. Getting some of those preservatives and fillers and artificial dyes out of your diet is definitely something that everybody should be kind of interested in. It just seems like a healthy thing to do. I mean, any food that you can eat that doesn't have to have things added to it has got to be a little bit better for you. So we wanted to try and start moving into that direction of growing and raising our own food so that we just knew where our food was coming from. My wife and I are also both teachers at heart. Neither one of us is in the educational profession, but we really enjoy sharing our knowledge with people, and we really enjoy helping people understand things that maybe they don't quite understand. So we really like the idea of this possibly being someday being kind of a educational center of sorts, where people can come, they can harvest fruit, they can harvest vegetables, they can purchase meat products, etc. But they can also have the opportunity to ask their questions, possibly even take some classes or something like that. Another reason that Jessica and I kind of enjoy this permaculture lifestyle, if you want to call it that, is because we both have a very personal belief that people don't have to be what's ruining nature. That's actually one of the things that really bothers me. Anytime anybody thinks of nature, or if you tell somebody, show me a picture of nature, they're going to show you a picture of an elk standing in a northern Arizona pine forest. Or they're going to show you a picture of a river winding through a canyon. Or they're going to show you a picture of snow on top of peaks. But what's always missing from those pictures is that there's never people in them. You see, we both just believe that Homo sapiens, human beings, are a part of nature. We're part of the animal kingdom. We belong here as well. And permaculture is a type of lifestyle that basically allows nature to work for us, us to work for nature. Nature does not harm us. We do not harm nature. It's moving from a parasitic relationship to more of a mutualistic relationship, because we definitely believe that human beings should not be apart from nature, but rather should be a part of nature. So now you know a little bit of who we are and why we do what we do and exactly what Rockin' 8 Farm is. I think now it's time to get into a little bit of the explanation of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And unfortunately, I do have to give you one last disclaimer before we go look at the farm. This time of year in Central Texas, y'all, it's windy. There's no such thing as a day that isn't windy. So no matter how many days I tried to reshoot video, There's gonna be video that has wind noise in it. I did everything that I personally am technologically and economically capable of doing to reduce that wind noise, but there's gonna be some wind noise in the video. I apologize for that, and I hope you enjoy. So one of the first things that we are doing and have been doing here on Rocking 8 Farm is actually taking some time to watch the property. Taking an opportunity to observe and adapt to what's going on the property helps you to make some wiser decisions. You see, when we first bought this property, we didn't have two nickels to rub together, and that definitely was not the most responsible approach to chasing down our dreams. It's not an approach I would recommend for anybody else. I would definitely like to see other people take a much more responsible approach to chasing down their dreams. But for us at the time, it was something that we felt like we had to do, and to be honest with you, we don't really have any regrets. See, being broke, it allows for some pretty positive things sometimes. The first thing it did for us was personal growth. It allowed us to take the opportunity to discover a strength within ourselves that we didn't know was there. It allowed us the opportunity to earn something through adversity. And it also showed us that we truly did have a willingness to sacrifice for what it was that we wanted. But I think most importantly, being broke when we first moved to this property gave us that opportunity to observe and adapt to our land. We spent the first 10 months that we lived on our property observing solar patterns, observing flood patterns, observing rainwater runoff patterns. And by being able to observe the way that the land worked without any interaction from us, it really gave us the opportunity to think about where we wanted to plant our garden, where we wanted to build our chicken coop, where we wanted to start our vineyard or start our orchard. I think one of the best ways to show you what I mean by that is I'll actually show you how we designed our garden and why we put it where we put it. So one of the first things that we did know was that we wanted the garden close to the house. This just made sense. We knew that having it relatively close to the house was going to help to deter some of those critters who might make a smorgasbord of what's going on in your garden. We knew that it would allow us to keep a close eye on this investment of ours that we're putting so much time and money and effort into. We knew that it was going to mean that we wouldn't have to carry our harvest too far of a distance. And we also knew that it meant we weren't going to forget about it. It's one of the mistakes that a lot of people make. They want to stick the garden kind of back out of the way so that they don't have to look at it all the time. But number one, a garden is absolutely gorgeous. And number two, if you can't see it, you forget about it. So right now we're standing on my porch. And I want to show you first the area that we originally thought we were going to put the garden. When we moved in, we were dead set on the fact that this is where the garden was going to go. So as we walk down off the porch here, you can see that it is not a very far jaunt at all to this area where we thought about putting the garden. And in all honesty, we thought that this area of the property would make a perfect place to put a garden. As you can see right now, we've got some dappled shade, but there's also areas right back here that are fully sunned right now. It's a relatively flat area and it's close to the house. I mean, why wouldn't we put our gardens here? Well, our first year on the property showed us that if we have a nice wet, rainy winter, which is something that we obviously hope for, this entire area becomes an absolute soggy mess that is completely unworkable, and that it takes months and months to fully dry out so that you can get in here and start working the area. We also discovered that dry creek bed right down there, well, if we get one of those 100-year or 500-year floods, all the way up to this stump right here is completely submerged. It became fairly apparent that the area where we wanted to put our garden just was not going to work, and we never would have saw that if we didn't take the time to observe and then adapt to what it was that our land wanted us to do. So coming back up here onto the porch, we can walk back around this way and I'll show you what we actually did decide to do. We have a big porch that wraps about halfway around the house, and we have two entrances to the home. And where we decided to put our garden was just a few feet off of the porch in the complete opposite direction. So let's talk about why we chose this space after taking the time to observe the land. One of the first things that you'll notice is that the land slopes very drastically in this direction down to almost a draw. But there is an area right in here that is relatively flat. So as the water flows down the land, it pauses here and it pools just briefly before running down into this low spot and then running that way out into the creek. Now over here on the other side of the garden, you'll notice that down here there's another draw. The water tends to run this way across the property. It also from that side of the property runs in this direction. It pools right there in that area where all those trees are, and then it runs down this way towards the garden. Once it gets to right about here, there's another flat spot where it kind of flattens out and it tends to pool just a little bit. And then it runs into that set of trees, which forms kind of a wet weather creek bed that flows down to the creek that runs for a good portion of the year, generally speaking, if we've had a good year. So basically what this area forms in this area back here behind me in this L-shaped garden is kind of a naturally occurring swale. It's a raised area where water flows towards it and then kind of around it, but it pools just slightly before it starts following the contours of the land. Basically what that means is that this kind of slight mounded area that's just naturally occurring on the property is less likely to actually have water runoff. So nothing runs across the garden, it flows around the garden, but the water also pools and kind of soaks into that mounded area a little bit. Now, we didn't do an actual soil study before we put the garden there because we knew we were going to bring in raised beds. But my thought process was, if water comes across my property, slows there, and then goes to the creek, that's going to be the area where most likely there are natural deposits of good soil. And we've discovered while we've been here that sure enough, that mound right there has that really good creek bottom, creek bed, nutrient-rich soil, and then we put the raised beds in on top of that in order to not deplete from that soil directly, but because the soil is underneath the raised beds, the roots can still get down into it. Now, one of the other areas that we really liked was this naturally wooded area right here. I know it looks like a tangled mess, but that actually ends up being a really good thing, because as that water comes down through this area and into this mess, the water slows down. All of the trees and vegetation slow the water down, and then there's also a lot of rocks and things of that nature in there that slow that water down as well. So the water really kind of has a chance to start to seep into this soil that's near the garden beds, and it helps to retain some moisture in the gardens themselves. The other thing we really like about all of this tangled mess out here is that it creates a naturally occurring windbreak. Now the winds, this is the west side of my garden where all of this tangled mess is. And if you're in central Texas and you've got wind coming out of the west and towards the garden, our westerly winds are hot, dry winds. We don't get a ton of westerly wind here, but when we do, it is hot and dry. And that's the kind of stuff that just sucks the moisture right out of your plants as that hot, dry wind blows across the vegetation. So this does a really good job of blocking a lot of that wind, just kind of stopping it dead so that not as much of that hot, dry wind pushes into the garden. Another reason we're glad we didn't just rush off and put that garden on the other side of the house is that this garden spot is close to multiple water sources. This is our well house. The garden is not currently connected to the well, but that is a project goal that we have in mind. You can see that green hose running right there. Well, right about there, that's a city water supply. That's a spigot. And that's actually currently what the garden is hooked up to. We have a backflow preventer into the piping so that we don't contaminate the city water supply. So right now we're currently paying to water our garden. We're hoping to get the well house hooked up to the garden so that we're just using natural well water. That's a project that's going to have to happen in the future because I need to do some more research on exactly how to repair this well, or first troubleshoot this well and then repair it. And I also need to come up with the funds for any repairs that it might cost. So for now, we're connected to the city water supply. So watering the garden with city water, but I have the option of the well and I don't have to go too far from either water source. And one of the last things that we observed were the natural flood patterns. See, right down in here is a creek bed that right now is completely dry because it is our hot, dry season here in central Texas. The garden sits right here on this elevated area slightly above the creek. Now, as I said on the other side, during a big flooding event, that area was going to get washed out. I talked to the former owners who told me that they had been on this property during a 100-year flood event, and the water only came up to about here during that 100-year flood event. Now in a 500-year flood event, my garden is probably going to take quite a toll and get washed away. But I've got bigger problems if we have a 500-year flood event, because my house is also in the 500-year floodplain, as well as my barn. The structures were already there and there was nothing I could do about that. If we ever rebuild, we'll rebuild outside of the plain. But for right now, this is just a great place for a garden, and it's relatively safe from flooding unless we just have one of those massive flooding events. Now, one of the other things about these flooding events in Central Texas is that if it's gonna flood here, generally speaking, it's gonna flood in May or October. It just seems like that's when we get our deluges of massive rain that cause a massive flooding. Well, if it floods here in May, I will have just planted not that long ago. It'll be a bummer that I have to come in and replant, but I won't have lost a massive harvest. During the summer months, when we're doing the majority of our harvesting of our spring and summer garden, it's hot and dry here. So we use the irrigation system to supplement water, and we don't have to really worry about any serious flood damage occurring in the garden. So we can go ahead and harvest through the summer season. Again, in October, we have that opportunity for massive flooding, and I will have kind of just planted the fall garden and got things ready. So again, it's a bummer that I'm going to have to replant, but I'm not really losing any crop per se. And then as we get into the winter, we have relatively wet winters here, generally speaking, but it's not those flooding type rains. So while I'm harvesting fall and winter crops, it's generally fairly safe, and I don't have to worry about anything washing away to flooding there either. We would not have known any of this if we had just jumped in and planted our garden where we wanted to plant it. We would have been very sorry though when we washed our garden washing down the creek. So you definitely want to take some time when you move onto your property to observe the property and allow it to tell you what it is that it wants you to do with it. Okay, so we're actually going to come into the garden here, and I'm not trying to make this some sort of a garden only video of any type. It's just that the garden is a really good place to explain a lot of the permaculture principles that may be used on a property. And for me personally, my garden is also where I do a lot of my experimentation. I try things out here in the garden, and if they work well, then I know I can apply those things to other areas of my property. So again, I'm not shooting a garden video. I just want to use the garden to show you some of what I've tried, and then we can move out onto the property to see where I'm applying it in other areas. So obviously some of the permaculture principles that we've already talked about are observing and adapting to what the property wants you to do. I think so far we've also discussed about like what designing from patterns and paying attention to details looks like. This entire garden was designed by paying attention to the patterns of the land, what it had to offer to me, paying attention to those details and things of that nature. In addition to that, we've also talked about utilizing edges, because I planted this garden right next to the creek bed, and then I've also planted it over there close to that area where it's very heavily wooded and it creates a windbreak. Now, what's cool about this is that when I come out here in the evening hours, my garden is loaded with frogs. And frogs is something I really want in my garden because frogs eat bugs. If I hadn't put the garden this close to the creek bed, even though it's a dry creek bed this time of year, I would not have that type of wildlife here in my garden. And that's the other thing about permaculture design, is it kind of almost does that Field of Dreams saying from, the movie Field of Dreams, is if you build it, they will come. My garden is absolutely loaded with beneficial wildlife. I've got a ton of frogs in here. The wasps like to come in here in order to look for little critters that they can, predate upon. My garden is loaded with bumblebees, and y'all, I had never seen a bumblebee outside of a picture book up until this summer. And even last year in the garden, we did not have a real heavy, we had decent honeybee population that would come in and help pollinate. Y'all, I have no issues with pollination in the garden or anywhere else on the property. I have so many honeybees and I have so many of these bumblebees. Everything gets pollinated on my property right now. And obviously that's something that we work towards, although we didn't necessarily work all that intentionally towards it. It just happened. I think we've also talked a little bit about using small, slow solutions, and we'll talk about that more as we look at other areas on the property, but it is very important to move small. Now, we move small because we didn't have the luxury of jumping into something, but I'll tell you all something, even if you've got the funds, slow down. pay attention. Look at what your land wants you to do with it. And what that really means from a permaculture standpoint is that it doesn't really matter what piece of property you have, whether it's in the Arizona desert or Central Texas or Maine, you can work with your land if you are working with your land. So one of the other things I want to talk about while we're out here in the garden is applying self-regulation. It's very important that we encourage our land to become beneficial to us and that we benefit the land and that we're not harming it. So I want to talk about some of the things that we do out here in the garden in order to help produce a bountiful harvest and be able to reap what we've sown literally, but not further degrade the soils or create an unnatural environment that's not welcoming to local fauna. We use wood chips in our garden, and to say that we use wood chips in our garden is really kind of a play down on the word there. I'm telling y'all, we use some wood chips in our garden. I have yards upon yards upon yards of wood chips in our garden. I line my paths with them. I put them in my beds. It's a natural resource that's going to break down and degrade naturally. It's returning nutrients back to the soil. And also, it really helps to retain moisture. I water my tomato plants. These are 1 gallon drip emitters. I give them 1 gallon of water once every 2 to 3 days. And you can see that the tomato plants are doing quite well. It's hot and it's dry, but the plants aren't drying out and they're still giving us a very bountiful harvest, even though we're sitting in early August here in Central Texas. And a big part of that is because these wood chips help to retain that moisture. I also spend on average about 10 minutes a month weeding my garden. There's really no need to pull weeds because the wood chips do a fantastic job of keeping weed pressure down. What that means is that I don't need to add herbicides to my garden in order to break down weed material and try and get my plants to grow. It allows the plants to grow a lot more naturally. Some of the other things that we do in our garden is we try to use a very natural fertilization schedule. So obviously when you're running a garden where you're not using pesticides, you're not using herbicides, and you're not using man-made chemical fertilizers, you're going to end up with plants that have some dry spots on them. You're going to end up with some fruit that has some blemishes or maybe even some pest pressure. You're not going to have beautiful store-bought fruit, but what you are going to have is healthy soil, healthy plants, and food that you can feed to your families that you know is safe. So we use all natural fertilizers in our garden. I'm a big fan of products like Dr. Earth. For pesticides, the primary pesticide, if you want to call it that we use in our garden to keep things like grasshoppers and tomato hornworms and things of that nature at bay, is a garlic and pepper tea solution that we spray on the leaves, and it really does kind of keep the pests at bay. Now you're going to see that we do have some pest pressure. The grasshoppers do get in here on occasion, but like I was saying earlier, the frogs do a good job of helping with that. The wasps get in here and they kill some of those other bugs as well. So we do have a very bountiful harvest. I have more tomatoes put up than I know what to do with. I've got pickles that can last me a couple of years probably, and it's because of these permaculture principles that we're applying in the garden. As far as the design function goes, I put in this arched trellis, and it has just provided like you would not even believe, because basically it allows the plants to form this very heavy leaf canopy, and then the fruit grows down where it's not being beat on by the sun all day. And that's part of the reason that we've been able to have this cucumber harvest that just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. Like I said, I'm actually at a point now where I have so many cucumbers that I'm debating about whether or not I'm going to even plant a second round of cucumbers. So by using some of these design principles and creating habitat, creating shady spots, creating places and microclimates that wouldn't necessarily naturally exist in this area, we're able to provide this bountiful harvest for ourselves. We give to the plants, we give to the soil, the plants and the soil give back to us. Now, as we actually start to step out of the garden, I want to take a little bit of an opportunity to talk about utilizing renewable resources. You know, your property is going to give you things that you're not necessarily nuts about, but that doesn't mean that they have to go to waste. This was a very large oak tree that was very diseased. And that oak tree was actually also growing right underneath of our power line, even though it was a diseased tree. So I called up the power company and I asked them if they'd come cut down the tree for me so that I wouldn't have to worry about the electrical line. And they cut it down to a stump and I cut it down a little bit lower, but we're actually going to utilize this area. We're going to take and we're going to put some stones around and we're going to put a nice flat tabletop on top of there, and then we'll have an area where we can entertain. You know, I mean, having a piece of property isn't just about what you can get from it. It's also about what it has to offer you. It's about putting back into it. It's about enjoying it and loving it. If you don't enjoy your property, if you don't love your property, even if you live in an apartment, if you don't enjoy and love your apartment and make it a home, then you're not really going to have the desire to put back into it. These are 2 more diseased trees that we're actually going to turn into a nice big swing. This is going to be a great view for my wife and I to look out upon our property and see everything that we've worked so hard to build. Now, in addition to just doing things like using tree stumps to make projects, there's other renewable resources that might exist on a property that could potentially not be the best things you want on your property, but that doesn't mean that you need to totally devastate them either. When I planted my vineyard, we came through and we dug all the post holes, and I was kind of figuring out what I was going to do about posts. It didn't take me long at all to figure out that I had this resource available on my property now. Now, I'm not saying get out on your property and cut down every tree that you see. This particular post is made out of a material that here in Central Texas we call cedars, but it's not really a cedar. It's actually an ash juniper, which is in the cedar family, but it's not the eastern red cedars or western red cedars that so much of the country is used to seeing. So these ash juniper trees, and I'll show you a big one in a minute, are very rot resistant, but they're also a little bit detrimental to the land. You see, there was a time when all of this land was open, when buffalo and other animals kind of roamed the land, and what they would do is they would come through and they would eat the young cedar saplings or mash them down as they moved through an area, and it kind of helped to control the cedar population, or let's be honest, ash juniper population. Also, you know, wildfires were something that occurred naturally and that weren't just stopped the minute that a spark hit because we're so worried about damaging somebody's house. So wildfires would come through, and while the oaks and the elms would survive the wildfires, the ash junipers would be burned down. So now here in Central Texas, these ash junipers almost grow like weeds, and they really like to grow in areas like I'm going to show you right here. They'll kind of plant themselves right underneath healthy oak trees and healthy elm trees because the trees offer some shade and they offer some moisture retention. Well, once these ash junipers start to get very large, they start draining so much moisture from the soil that it kills these big beautiful oak trees and elm trees. So these ash junipers are actually kind of a problem. Now, I'm not talking about going through my property and just devastating the ash juniper population, because I want it to be a renewable resource. So when I have ash juniper saplings pop up like this one over here, I'm going to let that grow, and I'm going to let it grow until it gets big enough to give me some posts. Whereas something like that ash juniper tree over there, I'm currently in the process of cutting into posts. So I'm not trying to get everything completely off of the property. They grow here naturally. But until I can get some livestock onto this portion of the property so that they can do their thing, trampling it down and gnawing on it, I do need to control it and basically give the land a little help. So I get a resource of posts that I can use for building fences, and the land benefits because now the oaks and the elms and the other trees can grow and be healthy and not have all the water and moisture robbed from them. So we can use a resource without devastating a resource and improve the land at the same time. Now, back to speaking on the vineyard here, I know that a lot of permaculture purists would say that's a traditional style vineyard, that's not permaculture. Well, you have to make your design work for you. I mean, obviously I would love a actual food forest, but I mean, where does an actual food forest in the mindset of most of us that talk about food forests exist in nature? I mean, I can't really think of any place where, you know, you walk out and it naturally has a pecan tree as an overstory tree with an apple tree underneath that, with a blueberry shrub underneath that, with a grapevine climbing up the apple tree. So the reason that I have a more traditional style vineyard here is because it's a lot easier to pick grapes off of trellises and arches than it is to pick grapes out of apple trees. So you have to kind of set some of that purism aside and do what works for you. And just because I'm running posts and wires and growing grapes along them does not mean that this is not permaculture. I was very specific in my design for this. I was very specific in my location of where my vineyard is at and the potential growth of that vineyard. I designed this to work for me. Okay, so I guess that kind of brings us to the orchard itself at this point. Now, this is going to be a little tough to explain and show you because, quite frankly, I don't have a whole lot going on right now. So I guess this is also part of that future plans of Rockinate Farm. So right now I've got 6 fruit trees in the ground and I've got like 10 fruit-bearing shrubs in the ground. At some point, where we're trying to get this to is we will have 500 plus fruit-bearing and or nut-bearing and or fodder-bearing trees and shrubs in the ground, in addition to any vining crops or ground cover crops that we choose to install in the area as well. So obviously we've got a long way to go, but it's bits and pieces at a time. And that's why I tell people anybody can do this, because I had a few bucks, I bought a couple of trees, I put them in the ground. I saved up for a while, I had a few more bucks, I bought a couple more trees, I put them in the ground. Now that I have a few trees in the ground, what I'm probably going to start doing is trying to propagate cuttings off of these trees, and then I don't have to buy more trees. So that's one thing you can really keep in mind when it comes to, I don't have the money to put in an orchard, is that if you can get a couple of varieties of fruit-bearing plants or shrubs or trees or vines that you're interested in, then you can start to propagate those yourselves. For example, I have 2 brown turkey figs. Those brown turkey figs, I would like to have more like 10 brown turkey figs. I eventually want to have 3 or 4 different varieties of figs so that I kind of have that early bearing, mid bearing, and late bearing variety. So that way I have figs for a longer period of time. Well, with my brown turkey figs, it's really easy to propagate them. If you take one of the branches and lean it over and touch it on the ground and set a rock on top of it, it will actually start to root into the ground. And once it has done that, you can cut it off from the main plant, dig up the roots, and replant it in the area that you want. So propagating plants is a really good way to save money if you're trying to expand things and just don't have the cash to do it. Right now, I'm so low on varieties that I'm still having to buy varieties, because for every tree that I put out here, I want to try to find that early bearing, mid bearing, and late bearing fruit variety. So, you know, some apples that bear at various times. So I have apples for a longer period of time. Some peaches that bear at various times. So I have peaches for a longer period of time. I'm going to do the same thing with plums and apricots. So I have a lot of fruit varieties I need to buy so that I can then propagate off of those trees in order to generate more trees that I don't have to buy. So right now it's moving real slow because we're in the early stages. I've got 4 trees that are probably big enough, sturdy enough, and healthy enough to take cuttings off of and actually produce more varieties of those trees. But I still have a lot of plants that I have to get at least one example of before I can start expanding upon that. So long explanation for where we're heading with Rockinate Farm. Now let me kind of show you where we're at. Okay, so this is very difficult to show 2-dimensionally, and therefore I think I'm going to be kind of drawing with my finger. But you can see I've got a tree right here. You can also see that I've got a final tree kind of over here on the end of this line. But you can kind of see the black water hose and how it runs like that. So basically what I'm trying to demonstrate with the tip of my finger there is that this isn't a traditional orchard where you have everything in perfectly straight lines. What that is that actually follows the contour of the land in this particular area. So what we've got here is we've got an apple tree that's going to grow approximately 25 feet tall and have a canopy that's approximately 25 feet. Right here we have a Hansen's bush cherry, and right here we have an elderberry. This elderberry will grow somewhere between 8 and 12 feet tall and be just about as bushy. This Hansen's bush cherry will grow somewhere between 4 and 8 feet tall and be just about as bushy. So we've got a tall tree We've got a very big, large shrub. We've got a smaller shrub. Now, if you can imagine that down here at the base, perhaps there's some pumpkins that are growing out and vining along the ground. And then right down here below this big, tall, 6-foot shrub, I've got some little 3-foot blueberries. Basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to mimic what you see out there in my pasture, but we're trying to do it here with fruit-bearing varieties. And that's why this is traditionally known as a food forest. So it's tall trees, shorter trees, big bushes, little bushes, vines, things that trail along the ground, and but it all bears fruit or nuts or something with medicinal properties or fodder for your animals. So we're going for the food forest concept here. Right now we've got this small area done. Eventually all of that out there from the fence all the way back into here will be done. And then all of that area over there, that's tall grass, will all be done. So when we're done with all of the food forests, we will have approximately 2.5 to 3 acres of food forest, which will be nut-bearing trees, fruit-bearing trees, medicinal property-bearing trees, or fodder-bearing trees. So that's what we've got going on as far as the orchard concept goes right now. So let's go ahead and move on to the next topic. So for right now on Rocking 8 Farm, livestock is actually a little bit low. You can see my buddies coming out here to visit me right now. So the only thing that we have that you could really consider livestock, we have guinea fowl, and we've chosen to have guinea fowl because ticks are prevalent here where we live. And our dogs don't have any ticks. And I really attribute that to the guinea fowl. Ticks are their absolute favorite food. The guineas get out there and just hammer at the ticks, and therefore we don't have a lot of ticks on our property. Outside of the guinea fowl, we've got the laying flock. We have 50 chickens total, hens and roosters. They give us, a very decent supply of eggs. I also use my chickens to help me dispose of vegetative waste, because another one of those permaculture principles is to try and move towards zero waste. So while we work on what are we going to do with our plastics and how can we separate our plastics, because we don't have a recycling service that comes out to the property. So that means that if I've got plastics, I need to load them all up and haul them someplace to be recycled. But as we move more and more towards canning our own fruits, canning our own vegetables, that means we're buying less plastic jugs and buying less tin cans. So for that reason, we have less waste. Now the vegetative waste, the food that we either don't finish off of our plates, or fruit or vegetables that are getting a little bit beyond ripe, or cuttings and trimmings off of the plants in the garden, or when we come out here and mow and cut grass, all of that goes into the chickens and they process it like you wouldn't believe. Now, what I'm really trying to move towards with my chickens is, for us personally, having a free range flock is not realistic. We do have hawks in the area. We also have dogs that are very protective of the chickens, but when the chickens get flighty, the dog's chase instinct kind of kicks in a little bit. I don't want to discourage that because they're really good at chasing raccoons and possums off my property. So I don't want to get them to a place that they chase nothing. And but they love the chickens and they protect the chickens. It's just that sometimes they get playful with the chickens. So free ranging our flock isn't necessarily really realistic, but I've kind of found a way to start free ranging the flock. And that is by having rotational paddocks for them. Hey, Jim and Jessica, what do you think of them apples? So our solution was developing multiple paddocks, and I'm trying to use my body to shield the mic from the wind a little bit here, but as you can see, there is a door right there on this side of the coop. We've also got a door, turn, right there on this side of the coop. So I can rotate my birds between two separate paddocks. Now our eventual goal is to add One more door right there, and one more door right about there. And then I will take this fencing here at this post and run it back towards the coop, and then split the fence down this row, and we'll put another paddock out here and another paddock over here. Once I get to a place where I have 4 paddocks that I can rotate the chickens between and basically leave them on fresh grass for a week, move them off of that paddock for 3 weeks to give it time to recover, or I could go 2 weeks on, 6 weeks off, whatever I discover works best. It'll give the individual paddocks time to recover so that they don't really have the ability to do what chickens do, which is scratch this down to dirt. So what I discovered when I moved them into this paddock was lush and green, and all of the trees had leaves all the way down to the ground. Now you can see the trees have leaves up to as high as a chicken can reach. When I moved them onto this paddock, it took them about 2 weeks to get it all scratched down to nothing but dirt. The other paddock that I seeded and started watering at that point still hasn't fully recovered, but it's been about 4 weeks. So I'm thinking that we can probably do about 2 weeks on, 6 weeks off if we're rotating them between 4 paddocks, and basically they'll always be able to be on green grass. They do love the grass, but the other thing that the grass brings in is it brings in all of those bugs. So they get to eat all of those grasshoppers and things that are attracted to the grasses when the grasses are in there. So right now we're rotating the chickens between 2 pastures or paddocks. We're going to eventually be rotating them between 4 pastures or paddocks. And that's how we kind of mimic free-ranging our chickens, or are going to mimic free-ranging our chickens, while not having to actually have them out where things can get to them. Okay, now for the future of animals on Rocking 8 Farm. And I think this is one of the things that makes this kind of a little bit cool, is that I have to tell you all my plans and my hopes and my dreams, because I haven't fully realized it yet. I don't have a fully developed property with all of the infrastructure in place, with all of the animals in place. I haven't been doing it for 15 years and developed a system that I know is rock solid and I know works. I'm still having to look at people the same way that many of you are having to look at people to discover what is a good way to do this. So future of animals on Rockin' 8 Farm. The next thing we're planning on moving into is pigs. And we're trying to decide whether our eventual breed that we're pretty sure we want is going to be the breed we start with or not. We've talked about the possibility of just starting out with a couple of feeders that we're not going to breed in order to just get used to doing pigs, and that may be a good idea. We do the breeders, we get used to raising pigs, we slaughter the breeders, we put them in our freezer, then we don't have pigs on the property, but now we have experience with pigs. That may be what we end up doing. We've talked about in long term having breeding stock of the old spot pigs. And honestly, the reason we like the old spots the best for our eventual vision is that old spots were actually bred to be an orchard pig. So since we're going to have all of these fruit and nut bearing trees out there, it would be great to have a pig that's a good forager and that was actually bred for cleaning up orchards. We can run the old spots through the rows between the tree and shrub layers and allow them to clean up all of the fallen fruit for us. From a lot of the research and a lot of the history that I've read about this pig breed, it can really survive primarily on what it roots up and what falls off the trees. And, you know, if we've got a really booming orchard, we'll have a lot of produce falling off the trees that would otherwise rot. So if we can run the pigs through the orchards, allow them to till the soil that's in between tree rows, which allows more water to soak into the ground and then be tapped into by the roots from the trees, and use those pigs to clean up that area, then it's kind of a win-win. They get a really good, happy life. We get some animals that work for us, and then we eventually get bacon. Another thing we would like to do is behind the pigs. So if we use like electronetting and move the pigs over to a new section of the orchard, we would like to bring in chickens right behind where the pigs were. Now, we may just come in here and grab 15 or 20 chickens out of our laying flock and move them over and let them do their thing in that area. Or we may run some meat birds, or we may, I don't know. But we've definitely talked about running birds behind the pigs. Basically, they do a really good job of taking that very fertile pig manure and dispersing it. They also do a good job of coming in behind the pigs and getting any of the non-beneficial critters that are now stirred up in the dirt. So we like the idea of running chickens behind the pigs, but these are all eventual future plans that we hope to get to. It's not a place that we're at yet. So I'm really hoping that some of you join me on my YouTube channel and follow this journey as we progress in this farming experience. So there you have it, folks. There's kind of Rockinate Farm in a glance. There's one more thing that I want to touch on before I actually sign off, and that is just do it. That's always been kind of one of my mottos here, and when I talk to people on a personal level and I have those one-on-one conversations, just do it. It doesn't really matter where you are. You can get started now. If you're in an apartment in the inner city, at the very minimum, you can get started by doing the reading and doing the research right now. Start looking up the types of crops that you would like to grow if you had a garden. Start looking up the types of animals that you would want to have if you had enough property to have animals. So you can start the research now. There's also absolutely no reason that you can't grow crops in a 5-gallon bucket on your patio at that apartment. 1 5-gallon bucket for jalapenos, 1 for tomatillos, and throw some cilantro down inside of the top of a little 5-gallon bucket. You've pretty much got salsa, folks. So get started now, no matter where you're at. Don't be that person who says, oh, I can't homestead and I can't practice permaculture because I don't have 5.5 acres like Chris does in Texas. It took us a long time to get here, and it's still something that we're working towards. Yeah, that's great that we have the property, but like I already told y'all, I've got 6 fruit trees to my name. It's going to take some work and it's going to take some effort. And that's the one thing that you do have to have. If you're not willing to work hard, then this probably just isn't the type of lifestyle for you. Because whether it's working hard at studying or working hard at putting things into practice, hard work is something that's necessary. And you are some noisy chickens. So again, just do it. Just get started. Get rid of the excuses and start living the lifestyle that you want to live. And as I've stated several times during the course of this video here, money does not have to be an obstacle to you chasing your dreams. You find that dream that fits within your budget, or you find ways to expand that budget in order to encompass your dream. You can do it. Now, one thing that people who do know me know is that I sign off every video with the same saying, and that's be happy and live healthy. But what exactly does that mean? Well, it means just that. Regardless of the circumstances that we're in, we can find a way to find some happiness in those circumstances. And the living healthy doesn't necessarily mean that you only eat fresh fruits and vegetables and never go to the grocery store, or it doesn't necessarily mean that you only eat a paleo diet. Living healthy to us is really more about that mental attitude. It's about that healthy mental state that you find from getting out in nature, from putting your hands in the soil. There are actual scientific studies and scientific research that have proven that when you have sunshine shining down on your body and you are putting your hands in contact with the soil, it is good for the spirit, it is good for mental health, and therefore it is good for physical health. So I want to encourage everybody to just do it, get out there, and until I see everybody again, be happy and live healthy.
Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to check out the other summit videos as well. They'll be available for a limited time on the Green Dream Project YouTube channel. Remember to check out the links in the video description for more information on our speakers and to find out how to get access to all the summit videos to watch anytime.